Okay, so in this video, I just want to suggest some basic strategies for how to approach animating the bouncing ball as part of our tutorial exercise. Kind of picks up from the last video, so I'm just going to jump right in. All right, so I'm going to go to the right. Oops. I'm going to make a whole bunch of mistakes as we go through this because I keep flipping between Mac and PCs, so I've got hotkeys going all over the place. I keep hitting the wrong buttons based on different operating system keyboards. Okay, so the goal of this assignment is to just animate the ball rolling up to the edge, pausing, and then kind of just rolling off the edge, or maybe it rolls back and kind of rolls to get a little more of a leap, I guess, off that. But the whole idea is just to let the ball roll off the pillar and do a little bounce so we can kind of explore squash and stretch. We can also, another technical thing that I want to see is the animation done in such a way that the ball looks like it's in contact with the ground, right? We made sure that there's a little almost like racing stripe on our ball, a little ramp shader, so that we can see its spatial relationship. So we don't want the ball to look like it's slipping on the ground, right? So you can approach this many different ways. The very first thing, though, the fundamental thing, is to figure out what the timing is, and then the spacing, and then the icing on the cake is going to be the squash and stretch that you implement later on. And as I mentioned in class, it's up to the individual student to decide how squishy or not the ball is. But whatever squishiness it starts out as, or hardness, however you want to look at this, it has to maintain that physical property. You can't all of a sudden, at the very end, make it all, compress a whole bunch when at the beginning you animated it as kind of a hard ball with only a little bit of squash and stretch, right? So you need to be true to the materials throughout the whole animation. Okay, so maybe as I do this, maybe the best thing is to go to a little animation setup. I don't need the camera sequencer anymore. And we'll just work from the graph editor. There is a character set for the ball itself, so I can set that if I want to do keyframing across the board. I'm just going to keep it simple and just work with what's in front of me, right? And make sure I can see the ground. Okay, so I could try to map out the timing. This is a tutorial. I'm going to just work kind of quickly, but give some ideas for strategy. So the first thing I want to do, and this is my own personal preferences, I'm going to animate, or I'm going to start with, sorry, come down here in the preferences. I do have the time slider set to play every frame, but the maximum playback speed is 24 flips per second. And then under the settings for animation, the default for Maya would be the auto. I'm going to go ahead and just make these both linear. As we discussed in class, most of the time, I think for beginning students, I really think stepped keyframes is the way to go. It's a great place to start. But this one exercise, the way the bouncing ball works, and because of its relevance to the Y translation that we'll see in the graph editor, I think linear is not a bad place to start. So I would stay away from auto, though, right off the bat, because I think it's going to get too smooth. But I leave that up to you. But I'm going to use linear. I'll just hit save. And I'm going to start, and of course the yellow here is the placement controller. The blue one here is the move, right? And the blue one right here, the red one right here is the rotate. I'm not even going to touch rotate for now. So I'm just going to deal with the translate attributes for the move. So right off the bat, we're at frame 1. I'm just going to left mouse button highlight and key selected. And let's go to frame 30, grab my move tool. I'm just going to move the ball right up to that edge, and I'm going to right click again and say key selected, and I'm doing all three of those at the same time. We could turn on auto keyframe if we wanted to. I'll leave that. It's going to be up to you. So move from 1 to 30, it moves to that edge, and again, it obviously needs to roll, but I'm not going to worry about that for now, right? So I'm going to go to, say, frame 45, and I'm just going to key selected again with the idea that when it rolls to this edge, I'm going to kind of wait for a second, right? I don't want it to roll right off the bat. And then I'm going to just make a judgment. I don't know how fast this is going to fall. 10 frames maybe? Okay, let's just do that. So I'm just going to move this and put it on the ground. Keep in mind that it's going to kind of roll off the edge here, so I'm not going to move it too far. And I'll just put key selected right there. And I'm looking at my animation curves as this moves along. So it kind of, it looks like it goes out just a little too far for me. So I'm going to bring it back right there and key selected. Okay, and again, I could turn on the auto keyframe, but I'm not going to do that yet because I want to have a little more control. So it's hitting the ground right here, and the ground is the timing, right? Every time it hits the ground, that's like the rhythm, the bounce, 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 right? So anything that's in between is that spacing. How long is it going to pause in the air and do whatever it's going to do? So the other thing that's going to happen is the arc of the ball itself, the peak of that should fall halfway in between where I start and where I end, basically where it's on the ground here, where it's on the ground the next time. So instead of animating this next spot, what I'm going to do is just make a little judgment call. Let's say the bounce is going to take another 10 frames, and I'll just move the ball that far, and I'm going to key all three of those, right? So this might seem a little odd, right? So it moves in between there. I'm kind of on an odd frame, but that's okay. Maybe what I'll do is, I'll leave that for a minute. So I'm going to move it this far, and then let's go just a few more frames. This time it's going to be a shorter little bounce. And I'll key select it there. And maybe it's going to be another little bounce there. I'll do key selected. Maybe this one's just a little baby bounce, right? Key selected. Okay, so we just watched the ball move forward. And again, it's a little hard to figure out what the timing is, so I can play it and I can kind of look at it through the time slider. But that's okay. I know where those are going to be. So I'm going to move here and, kind of on in between frames. Luckily, hopefully I would have these maybe at an odd number so I can find a frame in between. So I'm going to move that one. Oops. And move that over one. Maybe one more. Keep deselecting. Okay, there we go. So the ball comes down. In fact, let's leave those there. So I'm going to leave that one there, and it comes to this, so this is going to be the fall itself. But obviously it needs to bounce back up in the air. And this keyframe that's going to be somewhere in between this is going to be that midpoint. So now all I need to do is move up in the y-axis, right? In fact, before I do that, I'm going to turn on auto keyframe down here. So turn on auto keyframe. So now Maya's going to record any changes, but only in channels where something changes. In this point, I just want to put keyframes where the y is moving up and down, right? So let's just put it right there, and I'll make the bounce something like that. And then about halfway in between there, it's just a little off as far as my keyframe count, but that's okay. We'll make that one right there. And move this one just, one more frame. There we go. And let's move this just a little bounce. Okay, so it's auto keyframing the whole time there for me, right, as it's working. Okay, so that's already I get a sense of what's happening with that timing. So let's just look at this. Right, and I might decide, well, that's too fast or that's too slow. Before I do that, let's talk about this idea that it's spacing that's going on. So we'll hit frame here. And these frames that are the keys that are on the bottom, that is the timing, right? And then these ones at the top are spacing. I also know that they're going to flatten out at the top. So right off the bat, I'm going to select those and hit the flatten tangent, right? So flat tangents, so that I get more of a rounding going on in the bounce. So already that's going to probably look a little better. Okay, and probably needs, well, it is going to need more work. Those keys right there still aren't great, right? But the one thing about these keys here at the top is they're always going to be halfway in between these other keyframes, right? In the bounce, because it's going to come up to a peak and it's going to go back down, right? So right now these are just set as normal keys themselves, but we can come over and we can do this in multiple places. But if I come over to the keys here, I can convert to breakdown. And now when I look at the keys themselves, they're green, and in the time slider they're green. So if you didn't see this in class, I'll just, let's say I hold down shift and highlight those keys themselves. You can see what's happening is that as I move this keyframe here and this one, in fact I'm moving all of them, they slide over, but now I'm giving more space and changing the timing in between that bit of animation, right? I'll put it right back where it is. Oops, let's go back one. There we go. So we can just leave those there for now, and if I feel like the timing's not quite right, sorry, my mouse is trying to die on me a little bit. So if I select those here, let's change our little tool. I'm going to move it over a frame. So this one takes a little bit longer. This one's a little bit shorter in time. Let's bring that one over a little bit. Maybe this one comes over a little bit. All right, so we can see how those are spacing with each other. Okay, so they're staying there kind of at the peak of that. That one's kind of just a little bit off to that side. That's okay with the count, right? So those breakdown keys, and that's what they're called. So the breakdown keys themselves stay at that that position. The one thing I should have, so I was doing this kind of quickly, you can see that my as I shifted those keys for the Y, they kind of shifted with the Z that's going on here. So I really should have been manipulating the keys down here so they would stay kind of lined up with each other, at least for now. But I think that's just fine, right? So the point, I guess, in all this is to make sure that you're thinking about timing first and then worrying about the spacing. The last bit of timing I'm going to worry about here is so the ball bounces here right at the end. In fact, you can see where that little shift happens, right? So I need to go and maybe line these back up with each other. So let's take this one, right? Because that's where the those are right there. This one I'm going to slide back over. So these right here, that's the timing, and I want to make sure it's not sliding on the ground here at the very end. What I'm going to do is end up with that final roll, right? So in the Z trans, or the X probably has a bunch of keys in it, but for now I'm not really using those. I guess to keep it nice and clean, I'm going to move those over, and I'm going to move that one back, right? So I can see everything nice and clean there. So we see the timing keys and we see the spacing keys that are happening up here in the animation. Okay, the last one that I want here is, I guess it's going to roll just a little bit, right? So again, I'm just going to move this. It will auto keyframe in the Z. And later on, I'll worry about the roll. Okay, so let's go back just into the translate, frame, or sorry, in the Y translate. And frame up there. So the other thing I'd say about, excuse me, the curve that's happening here. So these are just linear. I haven't broken the tangents, which is this one right here, break tangents. So I'm going to do that for all of these down here. Oops, let me get that one. So I'm going to break all those tangents so they're individual. And if you're using the new Maya interface, you can see the dotted line to show that they're broken from each other. The tangent arm for this curve right now is below the direction of the motion curve itself, which is wrong because this little curve here is like a crowbar right on the curve. It's either bending it one way or the other. If it's below, it means it's bending it down, and that means the curve is flattening out just a little bit. So this speed here is actually slowing down. So how steep you make this depends on what you want the bounce to look like, okay, for your animation. But the tangent itself should always be above this curve for the ball bounce example, right? Because we don't want deceleration, we want acceleration on that. So let's just manipulate these curves a little bit. Let's take this one. In fact, let's make this one flat, right? Because it's going to kind of roll off and bounce. Pick up a little speed as it falls there. And, sometimes these are hard to see exactly what's going on. So I'll click and say frame to zoom in. And you can maybe select a single key in there and hit frame so that you can zoom in and see the curve in enough detail. So let's do this one. We don't want to go too far, right? Because we don't want it to go up and then go down and then go up again and then come down. So let's see what this looks like with the animation at this point. All right, again, we haven't really worried about rolling. Right, so just quick little bounce. It doesn't have a lot of squash and stretch with it, but I'd say the timing for a bounce is pretty believable. I'm not so sure right here at the end. I might want to do a few other things with that. The other thing about this, in fact, you can see with this curve, it's just a little bit off as far as the where this one sits. It's just because we're kind of at a half frame. So let's just select this. Maybe slide it over. Yeah, let's slide this one over a little bit. This is just in between. It's sitting at frame 68. If I make it 60, there we go. I made it kind of a half frame. Oops, let's click on this one. So the other thing is we're using this curve and we're getting a nice arc, but you could also come in and insert another keyframe. Oops, sorry, didn't want to do it there. At the point where your time slider is. So let's say I wanted, based on the tangents that I'm trying to use to influence this, if it's not bending the way I want, well, let's just add a little more detail to the curve, or another controller if you want to think of it that way. So I'll just insert key, and I'm going to make this a going to convert to a breakdown key. Oops. Right, and so I'm going to, in fact, maybe what I'll do is turn that off. I'm just going to move this around so I get what I want out of it. So you can see I'm really stretching the arc now. Let's bring this one over here. And we'll just insert key and convert to breakdown. Oops, did I get that one? Convert to breakdown. And I'm just going to move this around until I get the kind of shape that I want. And maybe that goes up just a little bit, and we'll bend that down. In fact, maybe I'm going to tweak that up a little bit so I get a nice big bell curve. In fact, let's look at this in real time. So I like that it kind of hangs in the air a little bit longer, right? So I would maybe do the same thing here. Let's move the little time slider. Let's try insert a key there. Let's insert a key there. See, that's right on top of it, so I'm just going to have to bend that up a little bit. So really kind of shaping that bounce. And see, this one would be right on top of it, so I'm just going to change the arc. Oops. And let's tone that down just a little bit. All right, so we're getting a bigger loop inside of that. And it's going to pause longer in the air at the peak of the bounce. Right, so I think that's a little bit better. I like that the way it pauses up there. Right, So you can see all the little tweaks that we would do for the spacing. Or sorry, for the timing and the spacing, right? So I've been moving these little keys to figure that out, and then I'm modifying these together. I'm going to turn those to breakdowns as well. So if I come in here and I decide that a frame needs to move, let's say this one. So let's say if I wanted to stretch that whole thing, you can see that they'll move proportionally out. You might have to do some tweaking on the curves themselves, right, to deal with that. But already I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to tweak that just a little bit. Right? So lots of finessing that you can do on those motion curves, and use the tangents, but don't be afraid to insert a few more handles. In essence, that's what these keyframes are, that allow us to see that motion. Okay? All right, it's 21 minutes. That's a long one. We'll save it there, and maybe I'll do a part 2.